firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go. Serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. You may be seated. May God add blessing to the reading of His Word. So this is where we finally have the 10th plague and the people moving out. There's not a lot of special stuff to look at as far as the moving out, except to make observations, which might not be real obvious at first, but I find it rather interesting. It says that there were 600,000 men. That's quite a lot of people. And then it said, and children also. Did you notice somebody missing in that? Women. It didn't even mention the women. Why that is, I don't know. But you can kind of figure that there should be roughly more than one woman per man, because back in those days of the slavery, the men were dying younger than the women, so there are widows and all the rest. So in children, you're expecting that, a couple of children, in that day and age even more per family. So if you take 600,000, add another 800,000, and then for the children, at least 2 children, we're looking at 3 million people, plus a great deal of livestock. That's a lot of people. There are very few cities in our world that have that many people in it. So they were coming up not just from the land of Goshen, but from all over the land. And it says there was a mixed multitude with them. Notice it didn't say there were some strangers, it said a mixed multitude. That means there are a lot of other people that had listened to the warnings about the blood over the doorposts and lintels, that had heeded the warning and had joined the Israelites as they left. So that's quite the thing. And God did that to give birth to a nation in a day. The next thing you'll notice is that unlike all the other plagues where some general kind of thing happened, they were given very specific warning what to do to keep it from happening to them. And for the most part, the Egyptians ignored it. They could have seen the previous hailstorm and said, okay, well, as long as you're inside, you're okay. What is God going to do? Even though Moses had warned them, they probably still had this idea of God as being some kind of one of their gods who doesn't know much and has to compete with other gods. But here it is, the specificity. Every single person or even livestock that was the firstborn would die. Didn't tell us how. We don't know that it was a necessarily painful thing, because at midnight, everyone who was a firstborn died. Now, again, the Bible says there was not a house that it didn't happen. Very often when we use words like that, it shouldn't be taken an absolute. If you had a second-born son marry a third-born daughter and they had no kids, there'd be nobody in that house that fit the qualification. But by and large, in every family, and it's really that, in every household, in every family, there's at least one person somewhere that's going to die. Nobody escaped it, and God knew exactly who was firstborn. Imagine being a twin. Like, you were born 2 minutes after me, and I'm the guy. God knows us exactly. He knows everything about us. He knows our birth order. He knows everything. An interesting point of view, though, Pharaoh wasn't the firstborn. How do we know? He lived. So what did he do to his older brother or sister? What happened in that household? We don't know about those things, but we do know about one thing. When it comes to royalty in the, hopefully not in the present day, but certainly right up through the 1700s, one of the most dangerous places to be would be a member of the royal family, because there was always somebody saying, hey, if I off him, I'm next in line to the throne. And there's no question that a number of Caesars killed their fathers or their wives or whatever just so they could be Caesar. It happened in the days of David, remember? Absalom was going to kill David so that he could be king. So these are the kind of things that we can just observe. So take comfort knowing that, as I'm sure you already know, but the world doesn't know it, God knows everything about us. Birth order is easy. It's tough for a lot of people to remember birthdays. God not only knows birthdays, but birth order and everything else. And of course, the Lord told us that God counts the hairs on our head. So He is intimately involved, and this wasn't an act of cruelty on God's part, because we do know that everybody, it's appointed unto them, wants to die. We're all going to die, and He just decided, instead of doing it the normal way, He's just going to make it so that if you were firstborn, you're going to die. And I like the description of it. He talks about from Pharaoh, the top of society, to the firstborn of the person in the dungeon. That's the bottom of the heap. And that's a good way to describe society. The topmost person to the bottommost. Nobody escapes it. You know, and a lot of times things have happened that it's the bottom people on the ladder that actually survived. Years ago, many years ago, there was a volcanic explosion in the South Pacific someplace. I forget the name of the island, but it was so bad it affected an adjacent island, and everybody died, except for the people that were in the dungeon, because they were below ground and they survived. So it's interesting how God works things at times. But in this case, nobody was going to escape by virtue of their standing in society, or lack thereof. The next thing is this. It says that Pharaoh called, and his whole household called for Moses and Aaron and said, leave. Up until this time, Moses had been saying, first please let us leave, and then we need to leave, and then let us leave. And now, it's turned around, and Pharaoh called and he said, you guys get out of here. And he basically granted them everything that they had made as request earlier. God had ratcheted up the pain until finally, okay, I'll give you everything you want. Up until that time, he'd been negotiating with them. This time he hadn't. And then notice this one little sentence. He says, and bless me also. It's like, what? after you have treated God's people so badly, you're asking for a blessing, and the answer is yes. And it's not to be unexpected, because if you look around humanity, all kinds of people want their lives to be blessed, and it doesn't matter in their minds how terrible they've treated other people. They maybe have gone through their lives not wanting to be a blessing to anybody else, but they want a blessing. People are always ready to have their hand out for a blessing. And kind of an adjacent thing, just ask the question. How many of you, to your best of your knowledge, have paid taxes? You haven't paid taxes? How did you get away with that? I started paying when I was 16. And how many have actually expect the government to be a blessing in your life? Gee, not many hands. And yet there are all kinds of people who haven't paid a dime in taxes that come and they want the government to bless them. Bless me, give me this, give me that. Here's Pharaoh, who has been, his wealth has been substantially part of the fact of having a whole nation. 600,000 men plus women, they're all slaves. Even the children had to work. Building the cities and so forth. Cruel to them. And now finally, when the pain finally hits his household, he turns around and says, and bless me also. I think it is an indication of the typical human heart. And yet, it doesn't matter how badly we've behaved, God still stands ready to bless us if we only repent. Look at the picture of the prodigal son, where the father was ready to bless him as soon as he came back. Even for Pharaoh, there could have been something, except that one more time, and we'll see this later on, one more time he goes back on his word. But there's something even more important than this. It says at the time that the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, meaning Jacob's offspring, the 12 tribes, they were really Abraham's, but the children of Israel were in Egypt, it says, for 430 years. It then says very specifically that the night they left, it was 430 years to the day when they showed up. Now I've done some looking, and I can't find anywhere in Genesis where it tells what day that Jacob showed up with Benjamin and the rest of the crowd to come under Joseph's care. But it was 430 days. Apparently somebody somewhere was keeping track of it, and it gets into the record. We just don't have that. There's a lot of things in the Bible that are referenced that we don't have anymore. We just don't have that information available to us. In fact, very often in Judges will say, oh, by the way, if you want more information about this, just inquire of the Chronicles of the King of whatever. And it's like, that's gone. You can't look there anymore. Or, and if you're interested, that grave is still there, that oak tree is still there. Whatever, well, that's long gone. You know, things change. So when I was a kid, we could tell people about the old man of the mountain. You know, and who's the guy that did the dictionary? Yeah. He actually referred to it that there stands for eternity an old man in the mountain. That's where we got the name. We thought it would be there forever. And what was it, about 10 years ago, the whole thing came crashing down. But in God's mind, obviously, to have it preserved for us, it's very important that we know the time frame. whether we think it's right or not, God actually is concerned about anniversaries. This anniversary in particular. You're going to observe this day throughout all your generations. Just like for us. I hope July 4th is an anniversary that is very near and dear to us, not just because we like fireworks and hamburgers and so forth. It also says this, that they plundered the Egyptians, but notice how they did it. They didn't make any motion, say, give me your stuff or else. They had earlier said to their neighbors, we're going to need stuff for the trip. Here, take whatever you want. Take it and go. Everything they took. Clothing, gold, and silver. Because the people are thinking, if they're not out of here, if they don't leave, we're dead. They said so. When it says that they said, please leave or we'll all be dead, they weren't saying that as some kind of hyperbole like, oh, my mother's going to kill me type of thing. They're saying it is a real thing. If these people aren't gone from us, we will all die. Let's get them out of here. What will it cost to get them out of here? We'll give them articles of clothing. So for their trip, we'll give them silver and gold so they can buy what they need on the way. Just get them out of here. And so the nation of Israel was driven out. It's something that God did because He knows that no matter how miserable somebody's life may be, most people will put up with the situation they're in before they will ever rise up and do anything dangerous about it, risk life and limb. It's been pointed out that revolutions only take place when the situations become intolerable for the people. In many cases, people would rather live in slavery. At the American Revolution, the mindset was a little bit different than what it has been throughout most of the world. And it's amazing that the American colonies, the people of the colonies, had the mindset that they did, which is epitomized by the words of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, or by that New Hampshire license plate, live free or die. There is something about people who are raised with some level of freedom and certainly knowing God's word, knowing what God's want, where it says that, knowing their future is in heaven, that says, I would rather be dead and be in heaven than to put up with this stuff. Knowing that they had a slave mentality, that's all they had been used to. They had never experienced freedom. He knew that they weren't going to, on their own, just go out there and do that. They had to be driven out. And that's why we had the plagues take place. But God had a rather significant strategy. You see, He's a God who keeps His promises. And long before Isaac was ever born, God had told Abraham, every place you walk around here is going to be yours, and your descendants are going to have from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Has never occurred yet. But He told them, He told Abraham, that his descendants would go down into a land that was not theirs and be strangers. And He said, they will be afflicted 400 years. And after that I will bring them out with great wealth. That's what He told him. And they say, well, 430, that's a different number than 400. Of course it is. Because for the first several decades they were living down there, Joseph was in charge. You think they were afflicted people when Joseph was ruler over all Egypt? No. But then something happened to Joseph. What do you think happened to Joseph? He died. And that's when the affliction started. And so they may have been in there for 430 years, but for 400 years they were afflicted. It's an amazing thing. How God makes these promises, He keeps track of these things long after human beings have forgotten them. But I want you to think about this. We can look at the patriarch and say, yeah, sure, that was Abraham. That was Abraham, he's different. That was Isaac, he's different. That was Jacob, he's different, because God was planning on doing some really great things through them. But no, God is no respecter of persons. That's what it says. But everyone who does right, God will do these things. And I want you to think about this. God hears our prayers. He makes His promises to us. He bottles our prayers up. You know, sometimes when we pray and when we weep over the things we're praying about, it feels like it goes up nowhere and the tears just get wiped away in the tissues and they're forgotten about and eventually we get over it. But no. It says God bottles those prayers and those tears up. He saves them. Why would He save our tears? Because they're precious to Him. The pains and sorrows of His people He feels. There is a thing in the Gospels about Jesus. And depending upon the translation, it'll say something like, He was deeply moved. The Greek way of expressing it is a little bit strange. It says like His bowels, did something. And it means that He was physically affected. And I can understand that. I'm sure the rest of you had this kind of thing. I know that I'm not unique. There have been times when I've seen either something happen to my wife, or a child, or a grandchild, a physical thing like they get their arm scraped really badly or cut, and I get a pain, a literal pain right inside. Anybody else ever have that? Yeah, we do. Why would we get a pain over that? Because God designed us that way, so that we would get a feeling. In Hebrews He says, we have a high priest who is one who is not touched by the feelings. Not just sympathize, but he feels it. God looked at those people, the descendants of Abraham, for 400 years. I forget how many generations He said it was going to be. It's in there, how many generations. They could have been counting down. They should have been counting down. God told Abraham 400 years and we'd be afflicted, and it's coming up on 400 years. Something should be happening. They weren't ready because they weren't planning on God keeping His promises. Most people aren't. But as we look at this whole picture, we also see that not only had they not been counting down, but nobody, whether it was the Egyptians or even the Israelites, see where it said they brought their kneading bowls on their back and they had unleavened dough with them because they had not made provisions for the trip. Now, I know there are some people who like to do things spontaneously. But if you're going to be moving away to a new place, it helps to make some kind of provision. Friday morning, Anthony moved to Binghamton. He and his mom, his dad, mostly his mom, and us to a certain degree made all kinds of provisions. Anthony, you're going to need this, you're going to need this. We gave him a table and other things. I gave him money, you're going to need this. Well, where are you going? It's like, oh, we didn't even think of that. Why would you not do anything about it? Because you never thought it was going to happen. And the beautiful thing about the way God does things is just at the point when people say, it's never going to happen. it happens. Why? Not just because of some strange thing that takes place in the world, the old what goes around comes around or anything like that. No, it's because God made a promise. God has never promised that everything will turn out all right and perfectly fine for everybody. The generations, the descendants of Abraham, for 400 years lived in poverty, even though Abraham had been the wealthiest man in the area at one time. They lived in poverty. They lived in slavery. They lived without any of the kinds of things that we would call the comforts of life. And you think, but that's not fair. We live in a world in which everybody is concerned about fairness. That's not fair. No, it isn't. You see, we have a very misconstrued idea of what's fair. You see, what's fair is the whole world should be plunged in ruin. None of us should prosper. None of us should expect to receive anything from God. What's unfair is that we have anything of good. I've read statements that children who grow up in a two-parent home, both of which are their parents, have an unfair advantage. And something inside of me says, no, that's the way it's supposed to be. Everybody else has an unfair disadvantage. But in many ways that's right. Because you see, if there's anything that good comes, all good comes from God. There's nothing good. And so those people, from our vantage point, were treated very unfairly. Why didn't God do something about it? Well, he did eventually. You see, God has this grand scheme. And we all have our part and place to fit in it. And many of the people who've been most terribly abused by this world, when they look at what God was accomplishing through it, have been glad to take that part. People who've been burned at the stake in ancient Rome because of their faith. People who've been kept in dungeons and tortured in recent years because they refused to kowtow to communists or Nazis, over and over again. And we're reminded about Jesus' statement about persecution, to rejoice and be exceedingly glad, because they persecuted the prophets like that before. We see these kinds of things throughout history. But we ought to understand from a historical point something very, very important. The whole world had descended into a moral cesspool, and Egypt was at the forefront of it. Worshipping everything except for the true God, willing to sacrifice children in order to gain the things they wanted. It was horrible. Enslaving anybody they could. It was a horrible world. And God needed to create a nation. A nation that would be the repository and the guardians of something very, very important. His Word. And you look at the Ten Commandments and all that was given through Moses, and there's nothing like it before or since in the history of man. There is nothing like it. And God needed His Word to enter human society in a way that it would be preserved and listened to, so that even today we can read words that say, do not commit murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. None of those things are forbidden in the non-Judeo-Christian tradition. It's only what the rest of the world has gleaned. So when we look at this pivotal event We need to understand here in the 21st century that 2 centuries before Christ, God was working on a plan that He had us in mind. He had the whole world in mind, but He had to get that thing started. And when we look at the world, sometimes going so far off the rails, going down the tubes, or however you want to describe it, even using analogies with hand baskets, you know, however you want to describe the world, when we look at it going that way, we can be assured of one thing. God has His plan, and we are part of His plan. And He will accomplish His plan. Nothing can stop Him. Not the greatest man on earth at the time, not the cultural things of the time, all the nonsense that's being propounded in our day and age will not stop God's truth in His Word. I love that hymn, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. His truth is marching on. We can be thankful for that. So, when things look pretty glum in your life, in our community, in our nation, in our world, be assured of one thing. God's still in charge. He was then, He is now, and He always fulfills His promises. Let's pray.